Well, rolling? Well, this is a broadcasting history interview on July 25th, I believe it is, 2002, which we're doing in the studios of WTV, Wartburg Television, here in Waverly. And our guest for the discussion today is Dave Nixon, Sr., who is one of the premier anchor personalities that have come out of Iowa, and also is a premier educator as his career has evolved. Dave is the executive dean today of the Emmetsburg campus of Iowa Lakes Community College at Esterville.
At Emmetsburg.
Emmetsburg, excuse me. I did a bad one right there, didn't I?
That's all right. That happens often because Esterville is in Emmett County.
Okay.
And even our students are confused.
So I'm forgiven.
That's right.
His television experience includes the news directorship and the primary anchor at KTIV Channel 4 in Sioux City. Before that, news director and primary anchor at Channel 9 in Sioux City. For a time, primary anchor in Des Moines at WHO, Channel 13. And then back to close out his television career in Sioux City at KTIV Channel 4.
That's correct.
So it's really nice to have you here today.
Well, it's great to be here. I enjoy seeing the studio and seeing where your students interact with the technology that you have, and I'm really impressed.
I think that's one of the magnets that we have around here.
That's right.
It really works. We'll go back and sort of trace the development of your career, Dave, but take you back to 1989 and a day, an afternoon in the newsroom when all hell broke loose.
Yeah, it was in the hottest time of July, and I remember at the time I was in graduate school at the University of South Dakota, which was only a 35-mile drive from Sioux City. And the practice was when I would finish at graduate school, whether I was teaching or taking classes, I'd drive into Sioux City and arrive in the newsroom about 3 o'clock. And at which time you go over the lineup, what's going to be happening in the news that night, write a few stories, you're familiar with that. Usually it's kind of a quiet time, the summertime in the news business. But about 3:15, we heard on the scanner that there was an alert called for the Sioux City Airport on a hydraulic problem in an aircraft. Now, normally the newsroom wouldn't crank up for that because there were a number of A-7s, the smaller aircraft with the Air Force Reserve, that would have hydraulic problems, and then they would land without incident, and there wouldn't be any reason to send a crew out. So this went on for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then we heard the voice of the control tower operator, or I beg your pardon, the voice of the emergency services in Sioux City, who said they had just talked to the control operator, and there were 292 persons on board that plane, not 292 souls.
Right.
I'll never forget that. And at the same time, the wire stories were starting to tick across on it as well. So immediately then, we knew that this was serious. The plane at that time was at least 45 miles east of Sioux City, maybe 60 over Storm Lake, and the pilot had very little control. There was one of our other reporters that had a scanner that had the frequency for airplanes, so we were able to listen to the control tower conversation with the pilot. And by that time, all available crews had been sent out to the airport,
Right.
and some of the crews had been dispatched east of Sioux City on Highway 20. Because the pilot had said, we may have to put this plane down wherever we can. Anyone who knows that part of Iowa knows that it's all hills,
Exactly.
narrow highway, and you just couldn't imagine
Not
putting a
100
7
feet of flat land out there.
yeah, with a big DC-10 like that.
Yeah.
So as objective as you try to remain as a reporter, and as long as I'd been in the news business, there'd been times when thoughts had crossed my mind about how the Walter Cronkites and others must feel at a very, very traumatic time.
Yeah.
In his case, it was the assassination of John F.
Right.
Kennedy. And so I was trying to rein in my emotions. And quite frankly, we, at that time, the newsroom really didn't know how we were going to cover this story. Because we were short-staffed, there were people on vacation. So one crew was dispatched to the main runway at the Sioux City Airport, and then there was another crew that included an intern, one of our least experienced photographers, and who had just joined us full time, by the way. It may have been his second or third week. So they had been dispatched to the airport, and all that time we're listening and we're doing cut-ins, much like you see there.
There's the original cut-in.
And we were interrupting program to tell the viewers what was going on out there. The fact that this big airplane was trying to make it to Sioux City was a large enough story itself.
Yeah.
And I tried not to even imagine what would happen if that plane crashed. But after a while, I noticed I was gripping the desk, the news desk, with both hands, and I was probably lucky I noticed I was doing that. I could have passed out, but just trying to rein in my emotions. And there was an incident that happened in the newsroom, and you know as an experienced newscaster how those things happen. But in this picture, the viewers might see a little tear in the shirt. It was comic relief that happened. We were about an hour into the coverage. This was before the plane had arrived, had landed or crashed at the Sioux City Airport. And one of the staffers had come from the front office where they were answering the telephone and told me that there was a viewer that had called in and said, "Get that hick off the air. He's got a tear in his shirt, and somebody in Chicago or New York are going to see this and think we're a bunch of hicks." And the reason I think I tell the story, and I remember it so vividly because that really broke the ice. I laughed. We weren't on the air at that very moment. We were still doing these cut-ins, so the viewers wouldn't have known any of this was going on.
Well,
the truth is, I just threw that shirt on that day. I was coming in for a regular news day and didn't even notice it.
Normally you wore a coat when you were on the air.
Sure.
And you were this was a live cut-in out of the newsroom. And
That's right.
Well, that's a wonderful introduction to our interview, Dave, and we'll come back and talk some more about that incredible job that you and the crew did out there that day covering that story.
Thank you.
But now let's, excuse me, go across the Missouri River into Dakota City, Nebraska. Is that where your family, is that your family home then?
Well, we were hired hands. As a small child, I remember about every year we'd move to a different farm. My dad had grown up in Kansas, and he and his brothers had followed the harvesters up to as far as Canada in some cases. And when the three brothers arrived in Nebraska, they found three young ladies that they liked, and that one of them turned out to be my mother. So they stayed in northeast Nebraska working on farms. So I grew up not far from Dakota City on a couple of different farms. And when I was out there hoeing weeds out of corn in this farm field, there was a radio station probably 4 miles from where we lived. And at night in my bedroom, I would look out that window and I'd see that red light flashing. And it always amazed me that the sound would come out of that red light flashing tower into the radio in my bedroom. So one day I rode my bike out and I looked in, and here was a small building, and the disc jockey was in this building actually spinning the records. That's where the music was coming from. And the amazing part was that he was eating a sandwich. I mean, what better life or job could you have than to work listening to your favorite songs and eat on the job? And he's the one that told me about a trade school in Minneapolis where I could get some radio training. And we were not people of means, and in those days, we didn't have access to student loans or scholarships that are available these days. So I had an opportunity to take off for that trade school, and a year later, I started my radio career.
So you went to Brown Institute and then came back and started, and that station was KMNS?
Well, actually, my first station was out in western Nebraska, the Panhandle of Nebraska, and there's a story in that. The placement director at the school said, now, we have 2 jobs. We have one at Fargo, North Dakota, and we have another one in Nebraska. And I said, well, I'll take the one in Nebraska. That's my home state, because that Fargo, North Dakota is a long way away. The truth was, it was closer to Fargo from Sioux City than it was to Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and it took me 9 hours to drive to that first day's work. But the best thing happened, and I've had so many lucky things in my life. When I went to that radio station in western Nebraska, the person who owned it, who was a great broadcaster, they were the broadcasters that we remember that were serving their communities and so forth. A lot of local news coverage and so forth. So I had some good experience there, but one of the best things that happened is In those days, a person needed a first-class radio operator's license to work at a transmitter
Right.
and spin records by yourself because power had to be changed from day to night. He gave me the money to go to California to go to school to get that license. And I'll never forget him for that. And then after I came back to the radio station and worked there for a while, one of his associates in broadcasting said they had a job back in Sioux City near my hometown. And that was like heaven, because 2 years prior to that, who would have known that I was able to work in the same radio station with my hero disc jockeys?
Right.
Smilin' Sam, the record man, and Jolly Roger.
And that was the transmitter tower that you saw out of
the same building.
Yeah, right.
I would have to pinch myself to think that I was actually working in that same building.
Right.
And then 3 years later, I was offered a job in Minneapolis at a radio station. So I went to KTWB. It was a great experience. Again, the program director was elevated to general manager, and he gave me an opportunity to be the program director of that radio station. And in those days, there weren't that many stations in Minneapolis. There were only 26. You know, I think there are probably 50 now at least. But so there were some other great opportunities, and I had another mentor in him. And from radio then, the transition to TV seemed to be very natural, because at the time there was a greater emphasis being placed on being able to broadcast on television, much like we'd done on the radio, in the newsroom. And the television manager in Sioux City, Bill Turner, who's another great Iowa broadcaster, and very active in the Iowa Broadcast Association and so forth, and active in the community, invited me to come back and look at a job. I would have an opportunity to work on the air. But as the television news anchor, he was very insistent. He said, now, if you're going to be credible, you're going to have to get a 4-year degree, because at that time I didn't have one. And he says, and if you'll invest some time after your work shift or before you go to work, we'll pay your tuition. So that was my first relationship with a company that actually gave you tuition assistance to go to college. And it took me a long time, but it was a course here and a course there. But that experience was great, because I would get to work in the classroom with the traditional students, much of the same things that we were doing back at the television station gathering the news. I think that was probably the first seed for wanting to teach. At the same time, I was active in the Iowa Broadcast News Association. And our director, executive director, was of course Jack Shelley in that association. So I would see him frequently, and it is a great news organization for broadcasters. And Jack Shelley, I watched his career, and I thought, he was on radio, and then he was on television, and then he went to work in higher education.
So there was a model. Huh?
What a match.
Yeah, there was a model.
And I had a great deal of respect for him. And I saw the opportunity to be able to teach broadcasting, radio and television. I wasn't critical of the schools that were teaching it. It's just that I thought there were some things that you could, in curriculum development, that you could offer college students to get them ready for the real world.
Well, you had a couple of other, you also did a little radio management too, didn't you, out in
That's
at
right.
Hastings, Nebraska?
Hastings, Nebraska. There were 2 brothers who were in the banking business and cattle business, and they wanted to buy a small radio station in Hastings, Nebraska, and they said, if you'll be the manager of that, we'll make you a partner in that radio station. I really liked the job, and we liked the community, but it was the TV that was calling.
It kept calling you.
Right. It could have been my ego speaking, but so after managing the radio station, the opportunity to go back to get into television was strong. It was a real strong pull.
Well, let's talk about that operation that you worked for, and you've already spoken well of Bill Turner. Expand a little bit on what kind of a manager he was, because the fact that he encouraged you to get more education and supported you in that, I think already says quite a bit.
I guess at the time, Grant, I didn't value that until years later. Because I just took it for granted. It's like you're working with somebody, you just say, well, that's the way most people probably operate, but they don't. The other thing that separates him from broadcasters was that he was so adamant about all of us being involved in our community that once a month we would turn in a report, just those of us that were on the air or whether you worked in television production or whatever you did, a report to show what you had done in the community. And now his motive may have been the fact that every 4 years you'd have to apply for renewal for your license. But at the same time, he said, and this was Av Weston wrote a book. He was a producer at ABC television. Right. He wrote a book and he mentioned Bill Turner in there. And Bill Turner said the station that is involved in the community and gathers the local news will be the station that will probably be the most watched in the market. And I've never forgotten that, because that's true.
That was Bill Quarton's philosophy too, Dave. Yeah. Well,
and the other thing about Bill
public
Turner,
interest broadcasting through information services.
And this is what I've always tried to talk to the students about, is because there's more to it than coming in and gathering some news, shooting some videotape, and writing the story. You know, there's something back that we can give back to the communities too, and that's good coverage.
So, and I wanted to, the promotion line for that station at the time, I remember it when we used to visit relatives out there, was the Major 9.
That's right.
And that had to do with the network switch, didn't it, from CBS to ABC?
Right. There was in those days there were there were animated characters that were associated usually with cartoon shows and kids shows. There was a Captain 11 in Sioux Falls, and there were some other examples. And there was they thought that they would make a caricature, something comparable to that they could use as the logo for the TV station. And people would always ask that question, who is the Major 9, or what is the Major 9? Well, the original drawings showed a caricature of a person with, you know, like a cartoon character and so forth. So there were a lot of stories on how they arrived at the Major 9 part of it. Some of it was the fact that, and was a brilliant decision by Bill Turner. The station, that particular television station, had 2 networks. It had CBS and it had ABC. And as you'll recall, in those days, the logical decision to make, if you had to give up one of them, would to be given up the lesser of the 2, which in those days was ABC.
Right.
Well, Bill Turner got out his map, his coverage map, and he started looking at what other stations came into the Sioux City area, where their signals came in, and he concluded that there were very few ABC stations. So people wondered if he had his head on straight when he said, I'm going to give up CBS. We'll take ABC. Now, some of it is coincidence that it's just about the time that Fred Silverman at ABC had just jumped from CBS over to ABC and started building those powerhouse television shows, which gave them a good lead-in.
With young audience.
But the way he built that TV station was with local news. Because the television shows on ABC weren't that hot. But it was a must-watch television station because he had a real strong local news, weather, and sports. And the premier news director's name was Charles Harness. And Charles Harness was a very good newscaster. He was a very good journalist and a good writer. And then they had a television sportscaster at the time, Gene Sherman, who was the dean of sportscasters. He was very well known on the radio stations, play-by-play broadcasting of all the. So he had a lot of strength in that. And his early weathercaster, his first premier weathercaster, was Ken Lawson was his name, who was well known in the community. And then Jim Henry, Canyon Kid, that the viewers there knew him. Jim Henry was working in a clothing store and had just ended up in Sioux City because he was in the military at the Sioux City Air Base at the end of World War II. So there was kind of a combination of interesting characters that Bill Turner put together, and they were real strong. Everything was local, local, local. So then when ABC's shows started to hit, the big shows, then it was just to the sky. And you know, the thing that I still remember, and in those days of television ratings, when the ARB diaries and so were first being used, the #1 television show of the entire week was Lawrence Welk.
Right.
I'll never forget that. Huge audiences. And that was some pride for the local pride for the station when Channel 9 at that time, then some of their newscasts started creeping up toward those top 10 program ratings. And they were, almost nudging that Lawrence Welk show, which was, Lawrence Welk in those days was, it was a weekly television
Which
show.
means
It was
you
live.
were getting some very powerful ratings.
Powerful ratings, and it was all that local coverage.
And you were the news, 9 was way the newscast leader in that market.
Well, and I would attribute it to, we had some great reporters like Dale Serban, and I'm trying to remember others. That was a Charles Harness legacy. After Charles Harness left and sought another career, that was still there because he was real adamant about covering local city government.
Right.
And if you'll recall, well, just because of the geographical location, you have 2 city governments. You have one across the river in Nebraska. So there was 2 of everything. And there was actually 3 county governments. And so I think that kind of drove the newsroom. And we had some great reporters that were breaking a lot of stories on a daily basis.
Well, again, you're singing my song, and that takes content in order to have.
That's right.
But it also takes personality, and I know you're very modest about your role as a primary personality. But by the time you had put in about 6 years there at Channel 9, you were about as well known as any Iowa television personality, I would think.
And again, I credit the station. The station, we had great lead-ins on those network shows. There were a lot of promotions that we did. We were out in the communities a lot. That goes back to serving the community. The fact that we went out in the communities, it made sense that if we were out in a small community for whatever reason, that the people at home would go home at night to watch the news. They'd say, "Yeah, I just saw so-and-so." And
So you developed regional coverage, and in a pretty complex market.
That's right.
We thought it was complex when we had to pick up a little of
Cedar
southwest
Rapids.
Wisconsin,
That's right.
and you had South Dakota, Nebraska, and there's things going on in all of those places.
That's right. And that meant those were all different news sources that you'd have to call on a regular basis. And that was always a job for someone in the evening, and usually it fell upon maybe our college students that were working there in the evenings. We thought it was high-tech stuff, but what it was is they were like credit cards that we would have to punch holes in them for all the telephone numbers. And you'd stick that in that old phone and pull that out, and that would be your speed dialing to all the sheriff's office. You know, we had a stack of those cards that you
All
had to go
those beat
through every
calls.
night. Beat calls, that's right.
Right.
But that is those were the items, those news gathering tools that we just took for granted. But that's what was happening, is we were gathering content. And then it was later on that I heard it described by one of the professional news consultants as the success to a lot of the local television stations was attributed directly to the station that could choose the good lead, the regional lead at 10 o'clock at night. You know, the story that people would be watching.
The story that to grab them and hold them.
That's right.
Right.
Well, then, as you remember too, and there was a big change that was happening in those days. There's probably a lot of viewers that don't realize that there was a time when television newscasts started with the weather.
Yeah.
And an announcer would come on and say, "It's time for the 6 o'clock weather," and then they would do the weather.
And I think Sioux City was a market that got started that way.
That's correct. The reason that, and there was a sponsor, there was a sponsor every night that paid for that commercial.
Right.
And it was again Bill Turner who suggested that wouldn't it be better if they didn't do all of the weather right away for the benefit of their sponsors, and obviously he was thinking of the commercial interests of the station, if they would move that weather a little further back into the newscast. And I remember when we started doing that, but very delicately, because the viewers were used to seeing the weather right off the bat.
Right.
And now, unless it's changed, many of the experts still say that you can use that weather as long as it's 8 or 9 minutes or 10 minutes into the newscast, and many stations do that. They'll have a little tease up front.
It's a powerful component of the newscast.
That's right.
But in today's environment of multiple channel news, to start out your newscast with with a routine weather forecast every day would
That's right.
be death, I'm afraid. Yeah.
I guess you've just said the key. It can't be routine anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Well, so the Dave Nixon television career is establishing itself pretty firmly at Sioux City, and you get an invitation to try your hand in the capital city.
That's right. And that was a thrill because at that television station at WHO, that's the place where Jack Shelley had worked. Great names. Jim was still on the air there, Jim Zabel. And I had to pinch myself, and I was sitting next to the king of sports in Iowa, Jim Zabel. And what a great guy. That was a lot of fun. And there were some great reporters. In the newsroom, one of our reporters had retired from the Register.
Yeah, George Mills.
George Mills, the historian. He had retired from the Register and came back to work in the television newsroom. And here's the great part about that. I would sit there and marvel how we'd go up to the state capitol to get one story. And we'd come back to the newsroom and he'd have 4 or 5. And he'd do that every day. Yeah. So that was a great opportunity. Those were great people to work with. And some great experiences there. That, as a coincidence, was the time when Pope John Paul came to Iowa. And our producer, Jerry Holowinski, who had come from KWWL, was our producer, Jerry Howard.
Jerry Howard, yeah.
And he and I worked hand in hand. He was the producer, and so we were so revved up when we heard that big a story was coming to Des Moines that we lobbied to the news director to see if we couldn't do something more in extensive coverage. And then because there was an opportunity, if you wanted to send a reporter and a photographer, you could accompany the Pope's entourage the minute that they landed in Boston for 4 days. And part of the coverage included the fact that Iowa Public Television wanted to broadcast the coverage statewide the day that he arrived in Des Moines. So the boss made arrangements for a reporter or for a photographer and I to go to Boston, and we traveled with the Pope's entourage. So we covered those stories, the local angle on the Pope story, starting in Boston, and then the next day it was in New York, and then Philadelphia. And on the 4th day, we landed with the Pope's plane in Des Moines, and then they helicoptered yours truly and a Catholic priest from Sioux City that I knew, who was going to be the expert on the ceremonies. And we helicoptered out to the farm, Living History Farms, and we're on the air for, I'm trying to remember, several hours.
So you anchored the Pope's visit.
And anchored the Pope's coverage. Yeah. And I had to say, I kept pinching myself to say, is this really happening to me?
You've had some remarkable stories to cover, all right.
It was great.
Yeah. And during this time, we sort of just weave in the education theme a little bit. Bill Turner encouraged you, and you were interested in getting your college degree, and so you started taking classes at Briarcliff.
I always told my kids I was a slow learner. I started at Briarcliff while I was in Des Moines, and I hadn't finished my degree as yet. So I took some courses at Grandview. And Grandview allowed me to help out in their production studio, helping to assist the students a little bit. And as I said, at each venue, I had an opportunity to start working with students, and that's what I really liked, because to me, it was teachable. And at the same time, another great thing that happened, in my involvement with the Iowa Broadcast News Association, as you'll recall, that was a coincidence in those 2 years when we were working with the Supreme Court to allow cameras in the courtrooms.
Yes.
And the Supreme Court actually allowed an experiment. And as a matter of fact, I think you were one of the big coordinators of that.
I was the first coordinator. Yeah.
There you go. So, I mean, all of this thing, they just kind of fell in my lap.
But you had the second trial in Sioux City, and it came within the same month that we covered the Moses trial in Sioux City.
That's
so
right.
You were right up. Those two, your case and our case were the first two that were tried in the experiment.
Well, I was really happy. I was confident the Supreme Court would allow the media to do that, based on a lot of First Amendment arguments and the fact that this is open to the public. Why can't people watch it on TV? And I always thought it was so ironic that at the time the U.S. Senate didn't even allow cameras in there, but the Iowa Supreme Court was going to do that, which was great.
Yeah.
And I think that viewers and the public has benefited from that since then.
Absolutely, no question about it.
Yeah, so that was an exciting time, and I think that was the time when I was in the president's chair of the IBNA. I said a lot of good things have happened to me in broadcasting and news, and I'm just grateful for it.
Well, here comes another guy knocking at your door. It's a pretty good friend of mine by the name of Mike Beecher. And he says, we're trying pretty hard up here, Dave, to knock off this Channel 9 phenomenon, and we think maybe we need another ingredient here, and how about coming back to Sioux City?
Well, there's something that the viewer might not know about that I could tell, and you would know that, and I'm eager to tell it to you because of your background. When I got the call from Mike Beecher that morning, I was in Des Moines, and I was happy doing the news in WHO, and that was working out real well. And Mike said, what would you think about coming back to KTIV? Well, holy cow, they were the old enemy.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd been across the street at the other TV station, and I was so flattered that Mike was calling me because here's what the viewers may not have known. There was a lawsuit that had been filed against Mike's station over an employee issue, probably 6 months prior to that. And that employee, when he'd sued the station, subpoenaed me to come back and testify on his behalf. And that was really uncomfortable. So I was back because even though we were competitors, as you know in the news business, there is some camaraderie among the journalists.
Absolutely.
So here I was, I'm going to flash back to 6 months back to that trial. Here I was sitting in a courtroom in Sioux City, testifying against Mike Beecher's station and against Mike Beecher on that employee issue. And I was really uncomfortable with that. I'd rather report the news than be the news. So then I went back to Des Moines after that court case was over, and it was just, like I said, it was just one day that I was there. So that's less than 6 months later. Here, Mike Beecher, that I was testifying against, he's on the phone saying, would you like to come back and work at KTIV? So I went up there the next day, went to the newsroom, visited with Lynn Story, who was the manager, and Mike. And there were a number of reasons why it attracted me. First, I thought it'd be kind of fun because they had a lot of things going at the time. And Mike Beecher's a solid journalist.
He is that, for
sure. And used to beat us a lot on some news stories. And so I thought that would be fun to work with him. So I went back to WHO and regretfully announced my resignation and then went to Sioux City. So in February of 1980, I started working for KTIV.
Well, at that time, 9 was still dominating the ratings.
That's correct.
Yeah. But by that time, Blackhawk owned KTIV, and excuse me, maybe we should break this here. I'm having trouble with my throat, Jessica.
Do you need some water?
So as we resume the interview, Dave Nixon comes back to sit in the anchor chair at the enemy territory for Channel 9. Channel 9 is still dominating the ratings in that market at that time. But behind you, they now have, much in contrast to the condition of Channel 4 at the time Blackhawk bought it, which was a pretty weak station by that time. Now they have a legitimate news organization headed by a real journalist, Mike Beecher.
That's right.
And now they've got Nixon out in front of them Monday through Friday, 6 and 10.
That's right, yeah.
And
the best part about that was there were some solid reporters in the stable at that time. Bruce Scheid, one of them, farm news, agriculture, but beyond that, he could cover just about anything that needed to be covered. They started at the same time, KTIV and the broadcast company that owned it started putting a lot of emphasis on technology in the weather department. And I think they may have had the first radar weather.
I think that's right.
Yeah. So there were a lot of good things going on at that station.
And you got comfortable in the Channel 4 anchor chair pretty rapidly?
Rapidly because it was easy to be in an area that you're familiar with. And when at a time when I was the news director at one time in that market, I used to have a propensity to hire people who knew the local area if they were going to be covering the news. And and even though you could be questioned for that, I thought there was some value in being able to know where to go when the fire bell rang. And you know, and so I felt very comfortable being back and covering the news in that area. There's also a challenge in news covering a geographic location where you have 3 states. You know, some people said, oh, I'll bet it just drives you nuts having to cover 3 states, but I always thought it was interesting. You know, we got to cover 3 state legislatures. They were all a little different. Nebraska has the unicameral, the one-house legislature.
Right.
So all of that made that very interesting. And plus, I had some home ties to the area. I mean, so it just seemed like the natural thing to do.
Well, at some point, you and your son's budding newsman career crossed paths there at that station, didn't it?
Those are great memories. While my son was growing up, he never expressed a great deal of interest in getting into broadcasting. And I guess that's what surprised me when one day, out of the clear blue sky, after he graduated from high school, he said, Dad, I've decided what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to Brown Institute just like you did. So I have to tell you that I wanted to see how sincere he was. So I said, okay, we'll drive up there tomorrow. So I called in, made arrangements to take the next day off, and drove up to Minneapolis. He and his mother and I drove to Minneapolis. Enrolled him in school. As it turned out, at Brown Institute, you could start, I think almost every month they would start a new class. And it was just in a sequence there where he could start the next Monday. And then we drove to the nearest McDonald's restaurant so he could get a job, working at a McDonald's and going to school.
Right.
So when he finished Brown Institute, then he started in radio news in Sioux City at KMNS, which was the station that I'd worked for years before that. And he had a very good news mentor by the name of Jim Roberts, Jim Horton, who later became the mayor of Sioux City. And anyway, then he made Mike Beecher. He and Mike knew each other from news coverage. Dave was on the radio side, Mike was on the TV side. And when there was a news opening at KTIV for a reporter, then he hired Dave in as a reporter. So my son was doing some reporting. Then he started doing a little weather casting. When the weather person was gone, he'd fill in, and he'd do just about everything. Like the rover on a softball team, you know, you play about every position. And he and Mike had a very, very good relationship. And Mike allowed him to do a lot of things. And there was even a period of time when I was doing the 6 and 10 news, and Dave was doing substitute weather, that he and I were on the air at the same time. And that was a lot of fun.
And that has to be a pretty unusual situation, father and son on the set at the same
Well,
day.
I found out later, I guess there were some other combinations around the country, in Philadelphia and where there was a father-daughter combination.
I suppose it would happen, but...
It was a great thrill.
Yeah, oh, it must have been.
It was a great thrill. And Dave had established himself as a broadcast journalist. And matter of fact, he always liked the reporting side better than anything else. And most of his activities in Iowa news gathering was done in, you know, after he came back as a news director years later with the Freedom Information Council, and you know, he was into that big time.
Well, and he went on to have a full-fledged career as a television journalist and news director.
That's right.
Right.
And I don't know if that was a curse or a blessing, but
Well,
he would always end up, well, he was on this track to try to pursue a 4-year degree as well. And that's why he moved to Minnesota to work in Mankato, where he could work on the Mankato television station and go to college at the same time. And then he got started doing that, and then he got an offer to move out to Missoula, Montana to be a news director. And so he was out there as a news director, and after some time had gone by, the Mankato station was looking for a news director, and they talked him into coming back to Mankato. And he was perfectly happy in Mankato, and reminding the viewers that he had kind of grown up in Minnesota, because my broadcast career of 7 years up there is while he was in those formative years, into his teenage years. So he liked Minnesota. And as it turned out, after he was news director for a while at Mankato, that I left to go into education. And who should turn out to be the manager of KTIV the NBC affiliate, but Bill Turner, my old boss from
He did come back
from
there.
the old Channel 9
Yeah,
days.
that's right.
Because when there was a transaction change, they put Bill Turner in that job, and
Yeah.
and he became the general manager. But so I thought that was irony. So Bill hired him then as the news director, and he was the news director of KTIV in Sioux City.
So your son wound up as the news director of the station where you
Right.
had this.
You know, kind of tells you he never offered me a job either.
Well, he knew you were bound to be an educator, Dave. Well, let's. You're getting down toward the 9th year in that job at KTIV,
That's right.
and you now have established to KTIV as the news leader in the market. You and that news team with Mike
Yeah.
Beecher, and
It's definitely a team.
it's
Absolutely,
definitely a team.
Yeah.
And on that fateful July day, another one of our alums, a guy by the name of Van Carter, was running that
That's
shop.
right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And so let's go back to July
July of
1989 and sort of walk us through, in addition to what you've already told us, this incredible experience. I've said that I believe this was the most devastating incident that any television station in Iowa has covered as a spot story,
Right.
given everything about it, including the terrible death toll that did exist, but the remarkable fact that that many people survived. And you folks really, one of the things, of course, that everybody around the world will remember is that image that very recent intern captured of that plane rolling. He was in the position, the only photographer who was in the position to get that shot.
That's right. And that's why I say I still look back, I still watch that movie occasionally, just wondering if that was a dream or if that really happened. The sequence of events that, as I told you a little bit earlier, you know, you try to prepare yourself emotionally for the big story. Probably until that time, one of the most emotional stories, difficult stories I'd covered was a Christmas Eve fire in Sioux City, and there were 6 children that all died in a house fire Christmas Eve. And it was a case where the parents had walked down the street to get the presents that they were hiding, you know, Santa Claus was hiding, to bring back to the house. It was just tragic. But so I thought that that was probably the most emotionally difficult time. And then in that newsroom that day, and as I said, it was such a hot day, and usually nothing happens in July. I mean, as you recall from your news days, you were out looking for stories.
The dog days.
And when this circumstance, when this chain of events started to happen, the other thing that you worry about is you're understaffed, because you're thin-staffed. And how in the world is a small TV station going to cover that big event? So you've got all this happening. Now, we had some terrific team members behind the scene that the viewers didn't even see, and I'll just describe a couple of them. The sales staff, who normally is out making sales calls, when they heard about it, all of them returned to the station, and they were taking phone calls, much like you see happen in a severe weather story. There were numbers of others that were listening to scanners and coming in and telling us what was happening so we'd know where to dispatch our crews. Now, our crews weren't that many. We had Kathy Egan, who, by the way, is the weathercaster, and because there was just not a large number of reporters scheduled in.
This is a small market television station.
Right.
Right.
So you've got Kathy Egan, and then the photographer that went with her was one of our regular photographers, and they were dispatched to the runway where they thought the plane was going to try to make it. And by the way, what a great relief when we're doing these cut-ins that, on the air. The tension eased somewhat when the pilot said he had the runway in sight.
Yeah.
Because everyone sighed relief. He sees the runway, they're probably going to land. So that's the circumstance that put Dave Boxam in that position to get a picture, that exclusive picture. What happened was our regular team,
The
what we
primary
would call our
guy
A
was
team,
out.
they're way out at the end of the runway down by Sergeant Bluff. So they got on the radio to Dave Boxam and told Dave, well, probably the thing for you to do, it looks like the plane is going to land safely. So why don't you just take the camera, put it on a tripod up by the terminal building, and just get some nice pictures of the plane landing. And then when the passengers come into the terminal, you can interview them on that harrowing experience, that 45-minute experience. So here's Dave, recently out of college. He'd interned for us, was hired full-time as a beginning photographer reporter. And he's standing there with that video on that camera on his tripod, and in comes this plane, and it crashes, and it burns in front of his very camera.
And that's where the flip occurred.
And the beauty of it was he let the video roll.
He
Now,
just,
some experiences in, have it in news business where people would shut the camera off, or they'd take their hand off, or they'd move the camera or something. But Dave Boxham just let that camera roll.
rock solid.
Now, we really didn't know, back in the newsroom, it was just a piece of video. We really didn't know what we had. In the meantime, and by the way, we didn't have live coverage in those days,
No.
so we were waiting to get the video back to the station and start showing some of the video. Prior to that, we were taking telephonics on the air of interviews of eyewitnesses that were watching it happen, and one of them was our very own meteorologist who was out at a golf course, and that was before cell phones, and he ran into the clubhouse. And he says, he said, I just saw that plane go over, and I saw that plane crash. So I said, let's put you on the air, Bob. So he went on the air, and and listen to this eyewitness description. And this is audio, but you could just see it. And he says, that plane was so low when it went over this golf course that I could have hit it with a 9-iron. And the golfers know that a 9-iron is a real short club that takes the ball up high, maybe, 50, 100 feet. And that described how low that plane was when it came in over the shopping mall and the golf course. And then he saw it explode, crash in front of his eyes. So while he was interviewing, we were doing those types of interviews, the crew was running in, bringing one of the first videos in. So when we started playing that video on the air and showing the viewers at home, that was shocking. And the emotional side of it was, when you saw that video, and by the way, the smoke could be seen miles away, and we had a live camera up on top of the TV station for weather purposes. But all they could see was the big black smoke coming up because we're 5 miles away from the airport.
Right.
And that was a sad moment because none of us would even think that anyone would survive that crash. But in that video, it wasn't long after that crash sequence and all the debris was flying and everything, that we saw one of the medevac helicopters coming up out of the smoke. And that was our first clue that somebody had survived, because they don't take dead people to the hospital. And by that time, they'd already started setting up the triage and everything. And that was part of my emotional relief, was the fact that there were survivors. Then the story shifted gears. And from that moment on, it became a story of hope because people had survived. And we started counting the numbers of survivors. Another anecdote. Kathy Egan called in on the two-way radio, and she was just steamed. She says, I don't know why the authorities won't let us across the fence to go out to get more video out there by, where the plane is out there in that cornfield and stuff, because she said there are some sightseers walking around out there. As it turned out, those sightseers were survivors. They were in street clothes, in suits and nice clothes, and they had gotten out of the fuselage of that plane, and they were walking along the runway. They weren't sightseers at all. I mean, that was another remarkable story. Now, here's a journalistic story that we tell publicly, but it wouldn't have done us any good to argue it at the moment. The authorities would not allow the news media to go across the fence to go out there and cover that. And while we made an argument, at least quietly, to the local authorities that the news media had a right as an eyewitness for the public to be out there on public property, we didn't win that argument at the scene while all that was happening. And we weren't going to argue that. We said someday later we'll make the argument, but now's not a good time to do that. Because we were able to cover the story as best as we could from that vantage point. The pictures that were shown later, that were published later in some of the national news magazines, came from some of the rescue workers who had cameras. And one in particular was a deputy sheriff who had a camera, and he'd taken a couple of shots out there. So what we said later on, in a quiet moment, long time after that, we talked to the local authorities about the fact that that's why the news media needs to be out there.
Exactly.
There was another rumor within days after the crash, that there was thousands of dollars, maybe even $1 million on that plane in suitcases, and it disappeared. Now in our video, we could see what looked like money going through the air. And at first there was a denial that there was any money on that plane. What it turned out to be was money that had been taken out of circulation and was being taken to Chicago for disposal.
I see.
But the truth is, again, argument on the side of the media being there, that's why it would have been good to have a representative of the public there to see what, just to see what was going on. And maybe that wouldn't have happened. But back in that news desk, back at the TV station, our crew, we continued to work well into the night. We didn't realize how exclusive that video was until the other networks started calling Van Carter and asking to buy it.
Yeah.
We didn't realize until we came on the air at 6 o'clock with our regular newscast, we just continually broadcast news, that no one else had that video. And that became a prime piece of video. Numbers of networks paid for it, others didn't.
Yeah, some stole it.
When it was going up to the satellite, they just grabbed it.
Yeah.
That's why nowadays, all of them burn or put their logo on there, superimpose their logo.
Right. Yeah.
People always ask, I think that the total revenue from that piece of video was about $9,000 for the TV station. And they gave a bonus to Dave Boxham, and then the entire station that worked on that event, they had a big pizza party, bought pizza for us with that money and so forth. And then the rest of it went to the newsroom for technology and equipment. But so that was the result of that exclusive video. And we went on, we had a live newscast that night. We had two live coverages, I should say, that night with some extended coverage.
Extended coverage, right.
And then it was one of those news stories that had legs. It just never stopped.
Never stopped.
Because the next day, those stories about what happened in the streets when 300 people turned out without even being asked to give blood the afternoon of the crash, just kind of showed up. The people at a couple of the local colleges that took in the survivors' families. And then the story that was most memorable to me personally was when Captain Haynes, the pilot, was released from the hospital a week later. I mean, who would have ever thought that?
Yeah.
And had his first news conference ever. And he tells a great story on that too, but the point was, here was he was the symbol of survival of that plane crash.
Well, and he orchestrated the landing that was made as such as it was, but it saved, how many did you say survivors?
184.
184 lives.
And the truth is,
If he had hit those hills out around Mobile, there wouldn't have.
well, and they came in right side up.
Yeah.
The same information was programmed into the flight simulator in Denver, Colorado, where their United's headquarters are for training pilots. And there were a number of other crews that tried that same approach, and out of the 7 to 8 tries, only 2 of them landed the plane right side up. Or maybe none of them did. I'll have to recall, because Captain Haynes told that story at his
Because he
recent
didn't have any rudder control.
No rudder control.
Right.
A training pilot, as a coincidence, happened to be back in the cabin, came up and asked if he could help, and they had figured out that if they moved the thrusters, the engines on that side of the plane, it would turn the plane that direction and so forth. So that training pilot got down on his hands and knees behind the throttles, and he was the one turning it from left to right.
Just no end of the incredible stories.
Right.
And there sits the man who sat in the hot seat through all of that, and I know you give all the folks out in the field all the credit they deserve.
Oh yes, because they.
But
Absolutely.
this is where, when you put folks who don't know news out in that position that you held, where the whole thing falls apart, you need to be a journalist to cover
That's
that
true, I
story
believe
in
that.
that position.
Yeah. I believe that, and when students come to the college and want to be on air, we always tell them that's where you start out in the field, because someday you're going to have to rely on that experience when you're on the air, because really you're an on-air journalist.
How many hours of continuous coverage do you think you made that day?
Well, we started at 3 in the afternoon, and it was probably midnight that night when I got home. And then we started early the next day again.
Sure.
And we did a lot of interviews, a lot of spot interviews from out at the scene. And that was the first real emotional time for me after the accident happened, was to drive out to the airport and smell it and see it. That was traumatic. And like I say, that was truly a life-changing event. You hear that all the time, people say that. But for me, that made me realize that your life can end in a second. And for those people on the airplane, some of them were about to have their lives ended in that 45-minute time period, and others would survive. And that was the thing that, again, the stories that you recollect the most is where in a row of seats, one person would survive and perhaps the others would be dead, or the other way around. You'd have numbers of survivors buckled into the same seats, and one person would die.
The randomness of fate.
Yes, and so I truly, and the students and even my kids, they think I'm, a funny duck when I say that. I said, hey, I'm just happy to be here today.
You bet.
Simple as that.
Even with a hole in your shirt.
That's right. That's right.
That lady she wanted us to send the right message from Iowa, didn't she?
Well, see, my wife was a little perturbed too, because I had blue shirts. I worked in blue shirts.
Sure.
And that one should have been in the bin to be sewed. And she'll never forgive me for that, but it became a real good moment for a release.
It was a tension reliever for
That's
sure.
right.
Well, I know you. Again, if this Sioux City was market number 100, and do you remember?
It was like maybe 125 or something like that. Yeah,
I think so.
Right.
So you, even though it was a professional news staff, it was a small news staff.
Right.
There was no live truck.
That's
Your
right.
live reports all came over the telephone. There were no cell phones.
That's right.
There certainly weren't any satellite trucks operating out of that newsroom. There were some around, and they all flocked up there, and they were much in demand by the time they got there. But you were really a low tech news operation.
And another coincidence in all of this, two of them that I see. It was just a year prior to that the local emergency organizations and governmental organizations had a practice drill on that very runway.
Yeah.
And they had it on a Saturday of all days. And we had to staff that. I'll never forget. I said, what do they do this on a Saturday for, because that's when you're real low on staff. And then we look back at that and how valuable that was to the coverage. But the other part of it was, probably less than a month or two before the accident, before the plane crash, the press club had been meeting with the local hospitals, and an agreement had been made whereby if there was I beg your pardon, it goes back to that year when they had the practice drill. With the meetings with the local hospitals, it was concluded that if there was one source of information, and we could try to determine which source, would it be the police? Well, they'd be busy. Would it be the fire? They'd be busy. The hospitals took on that burden of saying, we'll be the central point of release. So here, this little newsroom with a small staff and others as well, we are able to call the hospital every 20 minutes and get an update on all the releases of names, survivors,
and they worked with you on it
the whole way. It made us look like, boy, we must have a lot of people out there gathering. We were doing that by the phone from the newsroom.
Enlightened way to do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, in the meantime, Dave Nixon, the student, he's got his BA degree from Briarcliff. So he heads up the road 35 miles to Vermilion, South Dakota, and starts working on a master's degree.
Right, and teaching, and that was my motive in the master's program, was to teach. So they allowed me to teach a couple of classes a semester while I'd take classes. And that gave me an opportunity to realize that that's what I wanted to do. And it's a coincidence, I was in a 5-year contract at the TV station that was going to end in 1990, and coincidentally, that was the time when I could finish the terminal degree and finish the doctorate in a nice, clean package and segue into education.
So you leave Sioux City not only with a distinguished career as a broadcast journalist, but with a doctorate in education administration.
Yep.
And you cast your lot with Iowa Lakes Community College.
That's right.
As an instructor.
Started out as an instructor because at the time there wasn't any broadcast media program. And the thrill of that was writing the curriculum, developing the curriculum. Focus groups or advisory groups made up of broadcasters developed that program. The state approved it, and we had our first class in 1991.
And then you moved into administration in...
Right, 3 years later, when our new president came, gave me an opportunity to move in. I don't know why he would want to do this, but he thought I was suited to marketing and fundraising,
Wow.
and asked me if I'd be interested in doing that. So he allowed me to jump out of the classroom into administration. But the day that I walked out of the classroom, I never left teaching because that continues. Even in my administrative positions, I work with students all the time, and that's the part of the job I like best. And when I was in the fundraising segment of that for the college district, he had a purpose in mind. His purpose, he was like Bill Turner in being a mentor, and he was a great visionary leader. And for the community of Emmetsburg, where one of our campuses is located, the community needed a new swimming pool because the old outdoor pool was bad, and a new library because the Carnegie Library was only 2,000 square feet and not ADA accessible anymore, handicap accessible. So we designed a huge complex that includes 2 libraries side by side, a college library and a city library, all under the same roof, with a high-tech computer lab in the middle that's free to the public, internet accessible.
Wonderful.
And by the way, the people designed this, the people in the community. And then across the hall is this big Olympic-sized swimming pool for the entire community and our students, and a gymnasium that our students never had before, and a cardiovascular fitness room, and a senior citizen meeting room, and an ICN classroom for 2-way video classes, and a couple of other classrooms, and that whole package was going to cost $4.3 million. But my boss, the college president, said to the community, the college will invest $2 million in this if you will raise $2.3 million on your own, and we'll give you a fundraiser to help you do that, and that was my role. So in 9 months, that little community had come up with $2.3 million, adding to the college's $2 million, and within a year and a half, a new facility was born.
And Dave Nixon wears a new hat.
Well, and I never got every day I use something that I learned in the media.
Of course.
I've never left that behind me. And the student involvement, every step of the way. We produced a video that helped us sell the dream and all that stuff. It was probably appropriate that when we opened the facility for the public the first time, our keynoter was Willard Scott, the NBC weather guy.
The weather guy from it.
Because we wanted somebody that would draw a crowd, and he drew a crowd. But the community wanted to show off that facility.
Well, that sounds kind of to me like public interest education.
It's all tied into the same
Which sort of brings us back to the fundamental that you and I think, agree on pretty completely, and that is that the magic here is still in serving the community, and a lot of folks have forgotten that in the year 2002.
That's right, and when I'm in the classrooms today, when I'm speaking with fellow faculty, the concerns I think are universal. I think it's a community that's concerned about trust, greed, the things that some of our students may have seen along the way and may have been misguided. And in some way, we have to teach our students. We have to teach our students ethics, just like we did every day in the newsroom. I mean, every day we wrestled with ethical questions.
Right.
And that's where we are now with young people of today, and citizens in general, because what's happening in our country is, people should be concerned about.
Certainly, it's a problem with corporate CEOs.
And in my job, probably the thing that I work the hardest on is trust, so that our faculty, so they trust administrators, so we can all trust each other. And to do that, you need to be objective and open and treat everybody the same.
Well, now let's go back to that cornfield with that KMNS red light blinking, and,
right.
And that's been quite a ride. And
yeah, it has.
And again, one of the things that we sort of skipped over was the fact that you were the guy in that little black building. You had a first-class license,
right.
So that you could operate the transmitter.
Right.
You were doing the announcing. You'd go to the news machine and pull off the UPI copy.
That's right.
You were.
How did you know it was UPI? Because it was UPI.
I believe I remember it from.
Sure, and most of us in broadcasting had UPI in those days, right?
Yeah, right. And that's That's quite a path from where you are now and where you were then.
Yeah, as I say, it's been really good to me, and I think that's why people ask me now. I said, well, you know, who knows what's going to happen? I'm so excited about what's happening yet in the future, especially for our students.
And I'll bet that you can't walk down the street in most Northwest Iowa communities and not have people say, "You're Dave Nixon, aren't you?"
They say, yeah, you lost a lot of hair since you got off TV.
We proved it here.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. Well, it'll cause you to tear your hair out from time to time.
That's
all
right. Yeah.
But it's a lot of fun, and you tell it in very, very well, Dave. And thank you for coming.
Thank you,
and doing
Grant.
this.
I've had a great respect for your career, and you're a tough competitor too.
Well, we sent you some good people over there.
Absolutely, and I'm glad to be able to reminisce about, because you've made me remember, had some great memories of some great people like Steve Ridge and all those folks.
Yeah.
Mike Beecher and
Steve and Mike went over there together.
That's right.
And Jane Sewell, who is your marketing director there.
Jane and I worked together at the college.
Yeah.
What a coincidence.
Yeah. Well, Jane was she was one of the people that decided that she would leave the job she had with our staff in Waterloo and cast her lot with the KTIV over in Sioux
And at
City.
KTIV is when she met a broadcaster from Spencer
Yeah.
and got married and moved to Spencer. And for KTIV, I think while you were still at, while you were still at KWWL, she was the Spencer Bureau.
Yes, I
Yeah, that's
remember
right.
that. Right. Well, thank you, Dave. And
Thank you.
We'll turn off the